Okay, good afternoon everyone. Pnawn da pawb. Thank you very much for staying with us through what's been a really interesting but quite intense day so far. Normally at this time of the day we tend to be competing against different rugby matches going on. However, I think today we're competing against Glastonbury at the moment, so we won't keep you for very much longer, but the aim of the next 10 minutes or so is just to give a quick recap of some of the key points that we've covered today, to think a little bit about your next steps then following on from today over the next few weeks, and to give you the opportunity to share some evaluative feedback with us in terms of your experience of the module so far, including your experience of the National Conference today. And finally, to think about giving you the opportunity to continue to ask questions after today, and also picking up on some of the points people talked about earlier on about continuing with that sharing, that discussion with each other as a community of practice, for example. So just as a quick recap then, what have we covered today? So we started off this morning, Rhiannon went through and introduced the assignment, which I'll touch back on again briefly in a moment. Meg and Laura then went through course strand 1 with us, thinking about whole school approaches to inclusion, and in particular those models of disability, thinking about neurodiversity, thinking about resilience and growth mindset, for example. I really liked that comment that someone made earlier on this morning about the power of yet being used in school in terms of promoting resilience and that peer support for that. For example, I thought that was a really nice example from practice. And Anna and Alison then have gone through course strand 2 with us this afternoon, thinking about those strengths and weaknesses of whole setting inclusion processes, and in particular thinking about personalised provision, learner rights and effective communication. And then Fliss led the Ask the Expert panel discussion for us this morning, with a number of different experts then that I'm sure we've seen in the literature, and thinking about one of the key things that Fliss mentioned earlier on about that criticality in terms of assignments. It was really interesting to see where our expert panel members agreed and disagreed on various aspects of the discussion. And thinking a little bit then about some of those key points that came out from the Ask the Expert panel. So these were some of the things that came out for me, for example. So Bram Norwich was talking about that there are still considerable challenges in practice. Jean Ware was talking about the fact that when we're thinking about inclusion, we should be thinking about learning being a fulfilling experience for all learners. And this then was a really interesting comment that was made. Should we think about measuring excellence? What is it we mean by excellence, and how exactly do we measure that? Which is something I will start to think about a little bit more on our next Saturday together. Some other key points I think that came out talking about those labels as agency, for example. Did labels have a negative impact on learners, or actually were they powerful in a beneficial way? We also talked about the fact that sometimes we hear learners, but do we always listen? And as Nana said, do we always enact upon what we've listened to? And again, we heard a little bit about power relationships, especially when there are those differences of opinions. And I like these points that were made. As ALNCOs and practitioners generally, maybe we should think about not trying to do it all today or even tomorrow. And potentially as the ALNCO, we perhaps should not be expected to have all the answers all of the time. And another key point I think that came out, which relates very strongly to what's going to be the focus of course strand 3 going forward, that importance of networking and sharing of practice between settings. And thank you very much for those of you who've shared examples of strategies and resources in the chat with each other as we've gone through the day. So if that's what we've covered as a very quick recap today, what is it then that you are going to be looking at and doing next? So a couple of key points to think of really. Over the next few weeks and ongoing, there will be the opportunity to engage with those optional drop-in sessions at your individual HEIs. We've covered Core Strand 1 and Core Strand 2 today, and the focus therefore then of our second conference on Saturday, the 15th of July, will be to focus on Core Strand 3, which will be thinking about some of those key challenges that create barriers to whole setting approaches, and Core Strand 4, which is focusing upon some of those skills that might be needed to engage and challenge some of the key stakeholders we work with, in particular to try and implement change within settings. As we're only a few weeks away now from the end of the school term, I think we've only got 4 or 5 weeks or so before we break up for the summer holidays. It might also be worth starting to think about gathering some of that evidence from your setting before you break up for the summer holidays, which in particular might help you to answer the audit part of your assignment going forward, which, as we said this morning, is due in at the end of August. Just a very quick recap of the assessment that Rhiannon introduced this morning. So Rhiannon noted the title then was to critically evaluate the provision for ALN in your current setting and to develop that action plan to overcome barriers to inclusive practice. And it was suggested that this was a 4,000 word equivalent assignment. Part 1, which is the audit, which we've perhaps focused on a little bit more today, is that 2,500 word audit of practice within your setting. And we'll also recap and focus on again a little bit more the online presentation during the second conference Saturday, which as Rhiannon said, is 12 minutes or equivalent to about 1,500 words. So in terms of that audit, out of that 2,500 words, then the first 500 words or so are to offer a short introduction to the setting. So thinking about some of the key context, introducing your setting and your role within the setting, and also to provide a short general overview of current ALN provision and ethos within the setting. Whilst the remaining 2,000 words of that audit then was to focus more on some examples of current provision in your setting. And as noted, you might want to look at things like person-centred practice or collaboration or partnership working, for example, or universal learning provision or targeted learning provision, or that graduated response to learning provision, or potentially you might want to focus on something like the attitudes and understanding of staff towards ALN and how that impacts upon the ethos within your setting. And Rhiannon then shared this example of the grid, which is on PebblePad. And we had some questions this morning about whether we should use this grid to structure our assignment. And it was suggested that potentially being led by those headings in the grid might be a good idea in terms of setting out your assignment. However, the fact that the majority of your words linked to these is probably going to be in this fourth column would make it quite a long, difficult to read column if you filled all your information in on the grid. So potentially thinking about these different headings we've got, maybe follow these as headings within the main body of your audit. However, you don't have to fill these in on this Word document grid. However, it may be, as Rhiannon said, an effective tool in terms of starting to help with your planning going forward. For example, in this final column, noting down pieces of literature or legislation or policy that you found, which you will use to critically support the areas that you're going to be discussing. Just wanted to mention briefly this afternoon as well, in terms of where things are on PebblePad. So potentially things might not be as obvious to find as we'd hope. So thinking about where the resources for the National Conference Saturdays are on PebblePad, for example, and also the assignment documents. If you click on the resources tab at the top of your screen, you should see then that it opens up these 3 drop-down boxes. And the first one, the National Conference Saturday, for example, this is where you'll see the PowerPoints that we've gone through today that have been shared with the chat. A little bit further down on that page, this is where the recordings from today will be uploaded when they're available at the start of next week. And also the information, as Rhiannon said, about the assignment and the Word document, which had that grid in it, for example, is also available by clicking on that Assessment Documents tab, excuse me, on that area of Pebble Pad as well. So we've gone through very briefly this afternoon then a recap of what has been covered throughout the day. We've discussed briefly next steps and recapped very quickly the assignment, in particular the audit part of the assignment. Over the next couple of slides, we've got some examples of QR codes on here, which hopefully will work. And on this slide, what we've got is a link to an evaluation page, which we'd ask you to fill in either over the next few moments or just after we finish this afternoon. And this form, so we've got a form in Cymraeg and a form in English as well, will ask you to evaluate your experience on the module so far. So thinking about the previous modules that we've done, you would have had a similar exercise in terms of what was going well, what might have been improved, what you'd found beneficial so far. So I will leave that slide up on screen for a couple of moments so that you can access the QR code. And if you can fill those evaluation forms in for us, please. Those evaluation forms are anonymous. Your names won't be on them, but they are useful feedback for the team in terms of preparing for the national conferences, for example. Okay, so I'll leave that on for another few seconds or so.
Di, there's just a comment in the chat asking if we could paste the link for the evaluation into the chat as well.
Okay, I will try and do that in a second then.
Fab,
thank you for sharing that. I will come out to the presentation in a second and I'll share that. And then whilst you're waiting for me to post that link in the chat as well, I've just put up a final slide, which has got a different QR code on it, which will take you to a Padlet. And sometimes we move away from the conferences at the end of the day and think, oh, I wish I'd had the opportunity to ask that question, or something's cropped up as you've reflected on the day. So this final QR code on this slide will take you to a Padlet, which will be monitored over the next couple of weeks or so, which will either give you the opportunity to ask some questions following on from today, or in terms of community of practice, for example, which somebody mentioned earlier on, and sharing ideas and keeping in touch with each other, it does give you an opportunity to keep in touch as a group on that Padlet outside of the confines of the national conference as well. So these PowerPoint slides have been posted on the chat. I will just stop sharing my screen now and come out and post those links into the chat. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point.
I've done it, Di. Sorry,
done it. Oh.
I couldn't unmute quick enough.
Yeah, and thank you. I could
all
see
up
the
there.
messages then.
Okay. You can't click on the link.
No, sorry, when I click on the link, it is just taking me to a big scan of the QR code. I just wanted the link to get to the form, please.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
If you click on the image, it pops the image up and then you can click on the link. But on the English version, the Welsh one opens up no problem. But for some reason on the English version, when I click on that link, it tells me that they can't find the form. Okay. But the QR code works, so. Hang on. I'll just find the link.
Thank you, sorry.
Oh, you know, these things, when they're good, they work well, but sometimes, yeah, hang on. I'm just searching up the email. Maybe I'll just give you the link. Oh, that won't work, Di.
That won't work. Okay, so the link in the chat now should take you to the English medium form.
Yeah, that's worked now. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. As long as it works, we can get there somehow. And then the final QR code is the Padlet, isn't it?
That's correct. So the final QR code just will take you to a Padlet if you want to use that to answer any questions following on from today, or potentially if you want to keep in touch with each other outside of the confines of the national conference. Very often what we hear back in terms of feedback is it's really interested in listening to each other's conversations, and sometimes it's quite difficult to keep those going in between the sessions. So if you'd like to use that Padlet as a way of keeping in touch with each other, then by all means do so.
This might be a stupid question now, Di. You're not uploading that Padlet to PLP, are you? Or are you?
I will do, unless people don't want me to.
Right.